Prairie Yard and Garden is a production of the University of Minnesota Morris in cooperation with Pioneer Public Television. Closed captioning is provided by Mark and Margaret Yankel Julien in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. Shalom Hill Farm, shalomhill.org.
Fall is the time to harvest those fruits that we have watched grow all summer. We have many choices to choose from, thanks to the horticultural breeding program at the University of Minnesota. Join me on Prairie Yard and Garden as we learn about some of those Minnesota-developed varieties of fruits. Minnesota has many fruits that do very well in our northern climate. Today my guest, Peter Moe, Director of Operations at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, is going to tell us about some of the varieties that have been developed over the years here in Minnesota. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Hi Larry, I'm glad to be here.
Good. Well, we got a long history of developing primarily apples, I think, is the most well known.
That's right. I mean, the University of Minnesota started apple breeding here in 1908, and so it's over 100 years.
Wow.
And of course, the first big success was the Haralson apple. They found an apple seedling. Of course, they were crossing apples from Russia and Canada and the coldest parts of the world and growing the seedlings here. And the winter of 1917-18 was very cold. That following spring, there was a tree that was full of flowers, had a good crop, and about 5 years later, that was named the Haralson apple.
And where does Haralson come from? Was that an individual breeder?
It was actually named after the first superintendent of the then called the University of Minnesota Fruit Breeding Farm. Now it's the Horticultural Research Center, which is part of the Arboretum, and he was the first superintendent.
You know, it's interesting that apple has been around that long and still performs very well for many home backyard gardeners.
It's a very hardy tree. It grows throughout the state pretty much. It's great for pies. A lot of people like to eat it fresh. It's a little more of a tart flavor, real juicy apple, and it was the #1 apple in Minnesota for 80 years. But I think most of the viewers can probably guess what apple took that prime spot.
Of course, breeders are always trying to introduce new varieties, and that's a real challenging process, as I understand.
That's right. It's a long-term process. It's really important to have more than one variety because, you know, Haralson kind of ripened in the middle of the season, so a few years later, the Beacon apple was introduced to have a good early apple. And since then, there's been other early apples. Of State Fair came out, and now the two best early apples are the Zestar, which came out in 1998, has a lot of the same characteristics of the Honeycrisp, crisp and juicy. But then the newest one is Sweet Tango, which homeowners cannot grow in their own yards. It's a licensed variety, but the stores are starting to sell Sweet Tango right now in this area.
And that's a mid-season apple also?
That's actually one of the earlier ones. It ripens in the first part of September, and its parents are Honeycrisp and Zestar.
Oh.
But it is a long-term and expensive process because it can take up to 30 years to release a new apple, from doing the cross to evaluating the seedlings. We grow out thousands of seedlings here at the Horticulture Research Center. Then one of the scientists, David Bedford, is out every day this time of year tasting apples, and most of them get discarded because he's got very high quality standards. The apple industry is a global industry. Apples are coming in from New Zealand and Chile and, of course, Washington State and Michigan all the time. And so for a new apple to catch on, even locally, but certainly on a regional or national basis, it has to be a very high quality apple. And so Dave only will pick one that he thinks is better than any other apple that's ripe during that same season, and then it has to be a whole bunch of other characteristics. Store well and, you know, be good for fresh eating, or maybe some are better for cider or whatever it might be, but it has to be a really outstanding apple. It takes a long time.
One of those new varieties that was introduced just recently by the university is Snow Sweet.
That's right. That's a really good apple. It ripens in October after Haralson. And one of the nice things about Snow Sweet, besides it's a real good tasting apple, but the flesh is very white, and you can slice it and put it on a fruit plate, and it stays white without having to use lemon juice or anything on it. It doesn't oxidize. It's just something is different. The natural chemistry of that fruit is different from other apples.
If I'm going to put a snack tray together, I could leave it out there for a couple hours?
You can. It's very strange because a normal apple will start to oxidize just while you're eating an apple. You know, by the time you get around to the other side, it's already started to turn brown. So it's a unique feature. But unfortunately, it's in an apple that tastes good and is really a pretty apple and ripens kind of after a little later in the season. So it's nice to have apples that ripen early, and that Zestar, chestnut crab, you know, some of the good early ones, and in the mid-season, which we're just reaching here, you know, in the middle of end of September, the Haralson, Sweet 16, and of course Honeycrisp are in that mid-season group. And then in the October, there's Regent and Connell Red, Fireside, Snow Sweet, Honeygold ends up ripening in October most years.
What's it take in terms of acreage? I mean, if you got to plant 1,000 seedlings out or more each year.
We've got over 50 acres of apple plantings right here. And there, of course, other apples are being evaluated at the University of Minnesota West Central Research and Outreach Center and up at the North Central Research and Outreach Center in Grand Rapids. But by far the largest plantings are here. When an apple becomes an advanced selection, though, and it looks like it's real promising, it'll also be sent out to some commercial orchards who sign an agreement that they won't name it and they won't propagate it, but it's important to find out how the apples perform in a commercial orchard. If it good yields and if the trees are of a nice form, you don't get broken limbs, and of course it has to be hardy, and we also can get information on pest resistance throughout the state.
That's a big issue here in the state of Minnesota is basically we don't have a lot of pests, but certainly we do have the apple maggot, which is a major pest.
That's right.
Especially homeowners.
Right. If you live in a town where a lot of other apple trees are on and people aren't picking up the fruit and they aren't doing any control, the apple maggots are very prevalent. And they can damage a lot of the apples. And so, unfortunately, we haven't found a resistant one to that yet.
Apples are a major crop that many homeowners would like to put in their backyard. And what would you suggest?
Well, first of all, you look for the site where you're going to plant the trees is very important. It should be sun as much of the day as possible. It doesn't have to be all day, but the more sunlight you get, the better the trees will grow. And eventually when they start having apples, apples need sunlight to get good red color and sweet flavor. So sunny spot is important. They never should be planted in a low area. If you've got an area in your yard where water tends to accumulate after a heavy rain or in the spring when the snow melts, so you have standing water for a while, and that's a bad situation. The roots will rot on the apple trees. So sunny, well drained, and then depending on the rootstock and things, the spacing. The spacing determines how many trees you can plant. You know, some commercial growers will plant trees as close as 6 and 8 feet apart using some real dwarf rootstocks. For homeowners, normally I recommend 16 or 20 because you need space to mow around the trees and to access the orchard for picking and spraying and pruning and things, and the trees have a chance to develop and get good sunlight on all sides of the trees.
One of the things that a homeowner has a choice to make in terms of buying an apple is the rootstock. And what are those options that you'd recommend? Well,
for homeowners, the rootstocks that are generally available are M26. I would say that's just kind of an average, probably the best rootstock for Minnesota. It's considered about 60% dwarfing, and it's hardy. It performs well. It can get fire blight. So if there's a lot of fire blight in your area, if you've seen apple trees or maybe like mountain ash get fire blight, maybe stay away from that one, but that's a very good one. Another one that a lot of the wholesale nurseries use when they propagate apple trees is M7. If a lot of the apples that you find in garden centers are M7, but that performs well too. And those are the two probably the best for a homeowner to use.
What size is the M7?
I think that's about 50% dwarfing. Yeah, they're both kind of in that range. The trees end up being about, not a little larger than half of a full-size tree.
So a 10, 12-foot tall tree is typically.
In fact, we try to keep our trees at the Horticulture Research Center no taller than 12 feet. We prune almost every year, or at least we prune every year, but we try to prune every tree at least every other year. And if you keep them down below 12 feet, it's a lot easier to prune and spray and pick, and it's safer. You're not up there in tall ladders, and if they get bigger than that, it's pretty hard for homeowners to manage the trees.
We have other research going on in the Arboretum here, and tell me a little bit about what fruits we might expect down the road.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of work being done right now with grapes, and there's been grape breeding done all the way since 1908 as well, and there were some early introductions, but the only one that really stuck around is the bluebell grape. That came out in the 40s, and if you're looking for a grape for jelly or juice or even fresh eating, if you don't mind the seeds, bluebell's a really nice grape, and it grows well throughout much of Minnesota. Then in the late 1970s, a couple of other grapes came out, Swenson Red and Edelweiss, and they are both really good tasting grapes. They both have seeds. Even though the catalogs talk about seedless grapes and they say they're hardy, they're not in Minnesota. In fact, our grape breeders here have evaluated every grape variety that's grown, and none of the seedless ones make it through every winter in Minnesota. But any Swenson Red and Edelweiss, they're both good tasting grapes, and they can make some jelly and things like that too. They're not the best for wine because they have some of the species used in the breeding have a flavor that some people don't find appealing in a table wine. But the new grape breeding program then that got a jump start in the 1980s, another grape breeder, Peter Hempstead, was hired to work with Dr. Jim Luby. And more recently we hired an enologist that can make wine. Now they have several new varieties that make very good wine. And they're really the basis for a growing wine industry in Minnesota. And the Frontenac, La Crescent, and Marquette are three of the varieties. There's a couple others as well. But they're actually winning medals. Even this fall, there was a local competition, the Cold Climate Wine Competition in St. Paul was held about a month ago. And earlier, a competition out of New York State. And both times, Minnesota wines won gold medals. And they were competing against wines from all over the country.
Congratulations. Yeah. That's kind of quite an honor.
Well, and there aren't a lot of people that have just grown up in the wine industry in Minnesota. So the people some of these wineries spend a lot of time. They travel around the country, around the world, and study. And some of the wineries actually will hire a winemaker that might have experience from Europe or California to come here and work with them. And they also exchange a lot of information. There's a very active growers group, the Minnesota Grape Growers. They hold conferences and publish information, and then the University of Minnesota Extension has some really good publications too on growing grapes. And so we're all learning because it's a relatively new crop for Minnesota, but there's 40 wineries now just that are licensed and have started to produce wine. That number is increasing because grapes are a high value crop, and they grow in a lot of the same areas that produce good crops of corn or will produce good wine crops.
My vision of growing grapes is on the hillsides in France and Germany and so forth, on limestone rocky areas, and here we put it on good cornland.
I agree, Larry. That's my same thing. When I first heard that there were wineries in places like Marshall and even up in Alexandria and even down in New Ulm, and areas that really are really good farmland, but the grapes do well, and it's really surprised people here in Minnesota.
Some of these newer varieties, can we leave them on the trellis all winter?
Larry, that's really the outstanding feature. Besides that they make high quality wine, is that we have hardy grapes. There were some wineries that started back in the 70s that grew either really some of the vinifera grapes, which will grow here if they get winter protection, or some of the French hybrids, but they usually had to lay them down in the fall and cover them with mulch and then pick them back up in the spring and reattach them to the trellis. That was economically, you'd have to charge so much for your wine that consumers won't pay it. And so now the Marquette, Frontenac, and all the new introductions can be left up on the trellis and are hardy to minus 28, minus 30. They probably wouldn't grow all the way, in northern Minnesota, but most of the state.
Well, Peter, apples and grapes are the primary thing that a lot of homeowners want to put in their backyard, but there's a lot of other fruits that have been developed that will grow here in the northern climate.
Well, that's right, Larry. One of the best are some of the hardy plums that developed by the U of M, and there's a tree right over here I'd be happy to show you. Now, Larry, this is an alderman plum. And I don't know if you're like me, I almost stopped buying plums in the grocery store because they're picked so green in California. Even though I put them in a paper bag on the counter and check them every couple of days, they never really ripen. So for homeowners, this alderman plum is a hardy variety. It's a red plum with yellow flesh, and it's sweet and juicy, and it's way better than the plums you can buy in the grocery store.
What size does this plum get? It would not be as big as some of those, would it?
Well, it's not as maybe as the biggest plums in the store, but they're good size. I mean, they're I'd say an average plum size.
How many other varieties has Minnesota developed over the years?
Well, I think there's a total of about 8 or 10, but the ones that are the best ones that are still available, Superior, other than Alderman, is probably like a second best one. And then actually for a pollinizer, Toka, which came from South Dakota, is not quite as big, but it's a real juicy, a real great flavor. It makes a really good pollinizer. And also the plums have beautiful white flowers in the spring, and the trees grow quickly, so you can get fruit in just 2 or 3 years from a plum tree that you plant in the springtime.
Well, Peter, one of the things that I have problems with in my plum trees is they're short-lived, but I don't see any major insects or disease problems.
That's right. You generally wouldn't need to spray. You might lose a few of the fruit. There's an insect called the plum curculio that can get in and damage a few of the fruits, but it damages many of them. And there's a few other insects that might eat some of the leaves or a couple of diseases, but generally they're not prevalent, and so you can get a real good crop without really doing any spraying.
You know, one of the small fruits that intrigues me is blueberries. What a challenge, huh?
Well, I mean, they are, and that's a case where you absolutely have to have U of M varieties, because the high bush blueberries, the blueberries we buy in the grocery store, are usually grown in New Jersey and Michigan, other areas where it's warmer, and those are not hardy in Minnesota. But back in the 1960s and 70s, University of Minnesota plant breeders crossed the tall high bush blueberries with the native wild blueberry that grows all over northern Minnesota, and developed a whole series of half-high hardy hybrids. They still have the big berries for like the blueberries you buy in the store. Some are even the size of a marble almost, but and great flavor, and of course they're one of the healthiest fruits. They've got so many vitamins and antioxidants in them, and you have to do some extra soil preparation, but they're worth growing.
What does that soil preparation consist of?
Well, blueberries need an acid soil. So if you live in Grand Rapids or even in the Anoka Sand Plain area, Becker County, that area, generally the soil already is acid, but if you live in most of southern or western Minnesota or northwestern Minnesota, it's not. And so we do here, the soils here in Carver County are pH about 7.2. And so what we do is mix 50% sphagnum peat moss into the existing soil we have, and that is probably enough by itself, but we also will sometimes add 95% sulfur granules at a pretty high rate and till that all into the soil. So you're growing really in a mixture of half peat and half soil, and then the sulfur isn't even an added benefit. You try to get the pH down around 5 to get good blueberry growth.
Do you have to amend that each year, or will that last over a period of time?
That lasts quite a while, but some other things you can do is use pine needles or sawdust for a mulch, and then use an acid fertilizer. Mere acid or ammonium sulfate will also add some additional sulfur every year to keep the soil on the acid side.
And what kind of a yield would we expect? I mean, if I was going to put a couple plants in my backyard, do I got to have a dozen plants, or can I get by with 3?
Well, even if one plant can produce several quarts. In fact, once they're a big North Blue, which has the biggest fruit, you can actually get an ice cream pail of blueberries from one North Blue plant when it's really grown well, good soil and good water, and just in a good spot where it grows well. But a couple quarts, though, that's quite a bit. If you know what your price for the blueberries in the store, it's well worth doing.
They would go well on my ice cream.
That's right. They're great.
Yes. Well, let's look at another favorite of mine, and that's the apricot.
Oh, we've got some trees over here in the perennial garden. Let's take a look. Now, Larry, these are the two University of Minnesota apricots. Right next to us is Moon Gold, and the other side of the path here is Sun Gold. And you do need 2 varieties to get a crop. And they bloom every year. But sometimes they bloom so early that we get a frost after they bloom, so you don't get fruit. But in the years when that doesn't happen, they produce a nice crop of fruit.
My experience is about once every 5 years you get a crop.
Unfortunately, that's about right. But they're such a beautiful tree that a lot of people would plant them just for the ornamental, because they bloom ahead of the flowering crab apples, and those pink flowers are really beautiful in the early spring.
But here at the university, we don't have any further research going on with apricots, do we?
You know, that project is really not being developed much more right now. There are some other apricots, though, that are available, and I think one is called Scout. There is certainly potential for hardiness because their apricots are native in Asia and some pretty cold areas.
Well, it would be nice to get some varieties that were a little more consistent.
That's right. Also a little bigger fruit.
Yeah.
The Sun Gold and Moon Gold are quite a bit smaller than the California apricots, but I think if they're fully ripe, they taste just about as good.
Yep.
And I sometimes even pick them up off the ground because when they're really ripe when they fall, then of course they can't stay there very long, or else just because or they will ripen after you pick them too. So if you're worried that the birds are going to get them or something, I'd leave them on the tree as long as you can, but they'll ripen a little bit in the house.
We used to grow those, and
Yeah.
they got a canker in the stem, I think, and that's when I lost them, and I didn't replace them. But
Yeah.
I'm looking for some good apricots.
Yeah, well, these are the two that I know about right now, Sun Gold and Moon Gold. But it'd be worth trying some of these other ones. Maybe doing a Google search and seeing what's available in the area. And looking for, hardiness is certainly important. There's some work being done in Canada, I believe.
Is there other fruit that we should talk about?
Well, another one that I like that's a combination ornamental as well as a fruit you can eat are the pie cherries. We can't grow the sweet cherries in Minnesota. The U of M worked quite a while on sweet cherries and never was developed a real hardy one. But North Star pie cherry, that's one that doesn't need a pollinator, so you really need one tree. And they produce big, really nice red cherries. They're tart. They need to be used in pie or apple or peach or cherry cobbler or something like that. But something I learned from Dr. Snyder, who I worked with here a long time ago at the Arboretum, he told me that when they start to turn red, you don't pick them, you actually put bird netting on, or actually a little before then, and then leave them on the tree. And if you don't pick it, they'll continue to get larger and sweeter the longer you can leave them on the tree. And so but you have to keep the birds off or they will be gone.
Yeah. Well, I had that same experience this year with Nanking cherry. I saw a robin in my yard, and I said, oh, the cherries must be ready.
Yeah, that's right.
And I got out there ahead of them, but right behind me was the turkeys.
Okay.
And they cleaned every one up.
Well, that shows that they taste good. Everything likes to eat them, but the cherries, they all have beautiful white flowers in the spring, and a lot of them have nice dark green foliage all summer and attractive bark, and so they're really nice plants to have in your yard. And you'll have to share the fruit probably with the other things that live in your area.
Exactly. Well, and the Nanking cherry is a nice little shrub.
It is.
The big problem I always have is field mice come in the wintertime and girdle them, and
yeah, it's hard to protect a shrub. We try to protect the base of all of our fruit trees with a metal or a plastic screen. In fact, this past winter when we had so much snow, the trees that we missed, we found quite a bit of rodent damage. The meadow voles and the field mice both will eat the bark, and they're after that inner bark, which is nutritious.
Yep.
And they're under that deep snow. They're protected, and it's not very cold. And then we provide the food for them if we don't keep a good screen on.
Is that the only two products you'd recommend, is a plastic or a metal screening?
Well, yeah, the ones that we've used the most are the old standby was 1/4-inch mesh galvanized hardware cloth, and that is sink into the ground a couple inches. That's really good. It's it's kind of sharp and a little harder to work with, but there are several products now. Some look like the agricultural drain tile that have a slit down one side and can slip over the trunk. They can be not necessarily black, though they can be white or other colors. They work well. Then there's some spiral ones. But the spiral plastic ones work better on young trees because as the tree gets bigger, the spiral it just can't cover the whole trunk anymore.
Well, I know that's very important. Last year with all that snow we had, I had the voles and field mice on the bottom and the rabbits up about waist high, and the deer were above that on my apple trees. It was a disaster.
That's right. If you grow your own fruit, you know all the things that can happen to it. And when you go to the store or go to your local orchard or farmer's market and you wonder why things cost as much as they do, it's because there's a lot of things you have to deal with to get a good crop of fruit.
Well, what about some of our other little small fruits?
Well, strawberries are a great crop for Minnesota, and the University of Minnesota is still, that project is really is being phased out, but over the years has been very successful. And a lot of the breeding work has been done here right here at the Horticulture Research Center, but a lot of the cultural studies using different mulches and different methods of renovating strawberries and weed control and things like that has been done out at the West Central Research and Outreach Center in Morris. And that work is still continuing. A lot of IPM work too, different ways to control insects and fungus problems with still having safe berries to eat. And we have some really good varieties, and even though the strawberry season is pretty short, you can pick early, mid-season, and late, and pick fresh strawberries for at least 3 weeks. And they're just the strawberries in California, they're pretty good, but nothing beats homegrown strawberries.
Well, I agree. It's kind of like all the fruit that comes in. It's picked too early, and you miss that real sweetness that develops as it matures out.
That's right. And there's some good varieties from the U of M. There's some good varieties from Canada that I know some of the growers in Minnesota like, that have real large fruit, but still, most people people want a berry that tastes good. I like big size too, because I'm not a real patient picker, but still the flavor is the most important thing.
Yeah, no, I'm not into the size, but I know people want that king berry that covers the whole plate type of thing.
Yeah.
Somehow it doesn't have the flavor, does it?
Yeah. We'll be mulching our strawberries here in the first week of November, because we can't always count on the snow. Last year, there was, of course, the strawberries came through beautifully with all that deep snow, but we put about 4 inches of clean straw or marsh hay on our strawberries, and then we leave it on until you're sure it's going to stay above freezing, because you don't want strawberries to bloom during a frost period. And sometimes we keep the mulch nearby, and sometimes I've had to put some back on in the spring. But typically, we leave it on, and then the plants start to grow, and we don't have to worry about the frost damage in the spring too much.
But that would be also a point to make, that we really don't want to put it on too early in the fall, that you kind of want the ground frozen.
That's right. That's why we wait until November. That should have a couple inches of frost in the ground. The strawberry flowers can take down around the low 20s, and so that's what the mulch is really important.
I have a question. I really like the look of ornamental grasses, but I'm afraid they'll take over my yard. Any recommendations?
Well, grasses have a bad reputation of having creeping rhizomes, but there's really just a few that have creeping rhizomes. The vast majority are bunch grasses and grow in a tight clump. You do have to be careful about getting ones that don't have rhizomes, but the vast majority are bunch grasses. So you can look at the label and it should tell you. You can also take the plant out of the pot and look at the roots and see if you can find rhizomes. But many of the most popular ones are just solid bunch grasses. That's one of the best characteristics of a grass, is that it's a vigorous plant, but when it's just a bunch, you can treat it just like you would a chrysanthemum or a peony and enjoy it in your garden.
Ask the Arboretum Experts has been brought to you by the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum in Chanhassen, dedicated to enriching lives through the appreciation and knowledge of plants.
Well, Peter, this has been a very interesting subject to talk about, what the university's done over the last 100 years.
Well, that's right, Larry. I enjoy growing fruit and talking about it both, and eating it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the one thing we didn't talk about was pears. Have we done any work on them recently?
Well, the latest introduction from the U of M is a summer crisp pear. It ripens in August, and it's not a soft pear like a Bartlett you buy in the store. It's a crisp, juicy pear, more like an Asian pear. But I think it's pretty good. And then a lot of people grow Parker and Patton. They weren't developed in Minnesota, but they are hardy. And they're not dwarf trees. They make big, tall trees, but you can get a big crop off those pear trees.
There's one in Alexandria that is just huge and drops its fruit on the street.
Okay.
Every year.
Yeah.
Well, they're interesting. I don't know that I'd really want a pear tree.
Yeah. They're hard to deal with because they're really upright. And they're apples you try to get horizontal branches, and pears just want to grow straight up.
Exactly.
And they're not the same quality. That's the case for the pears from California. Actually, are better than what we can grow.
Well, I want to thank you for a great show and taking time out of your busy schedule to share your knowledge about the fruit breeding here in our Minnesota climate.
Oh, you're welcome, Larry. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Closed captioning is provided by Mark and Margaret Yackel-Julien in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. Shalom Hill Farm, shalomhill.org.